Welcome to episode 113 of 10 Minute Record Reviews, and today I'm going to talk about the Eagles' debut album on Asylum from 1972, Eagles. And this is the first Canadian pressing, famously with the interior picture upside down. This was also the case in a couple of American pressings. So this is a debut album from one of the most famous and best-selling rock groups of all time. But the band that releases this album is substantially different from the one which would eventually release Hotel California. First of all, this is the original lineup, which includes Bernie Leadon, the multi-talented, multi-instrumentalist who gives the band all kinds of credibility in terms of country and bluegrass. Related to that is a second point, that the band at this juncture is very much in their country rock phase. They have yet to have that infusion of rock and roll sensibility which Joe Walsh would bring later in the decade. The third and probably most important point is that this is the band in their most democratic phase. Both Meisner and Leadon had been in previously well-known bands, and Henley and Frey are not only the junior partners, they have yet to form that productive songwriting partnership which would propel the band through the later 1970s. Although the band is seen as the quintessential representatives of the California country rock scene from the early 1970s, in fact, none of the band members are actually from California. Glenn Frey was born and grew up in Detroit. The key association that Frey made in Detroit was meeting Bob Seger. Life might have taken a different direction for Glenn Frey because Seger could see his talent and liked him and invited him into his band. However, Frey's mom would not allow him to join because of the pot smoking which she suspected occurred in Seger's band, so that particular route of musical development was capped at the source. Running out of options in Detroit, and with his girlfriend moving to LA, Frey decides to follow her there. Through friends, he ends up meeting J.D. Souther, who would end up being his longtime collaborator writing Eagles songs, as well as Jackson Browne. The three of these guys ended up living in the same apartment building. As for Henley, his trajectory in some ways is a bit like Frey's. And just like Frey, he ends up making a connection with a better-known musician. In Henley's case, it was Kenny Rogers. At the time, he was in a local Texas band called Felicity. They changed their name to Shiloh. They record a few songs for Rogers. He ends up urging them to move out to LA, and he gets them signed to an outfit called Amos Records. They record a self-titled album for Amos. The album doesn't do very well, and the band splits up. But at this point, Henley has made another key connection, and that's with Glenn Frey, because Glenn Frey and J.D. Souther have a duo called Long Branch Pennywhistle, and they too are signed to Amos Records. Frey and Henley hit it off. They hang out all the time at a club called the Troubadour. The scene at the Troubadour included a whole bunch of up-and-coming musicians and hangers-on and scenesters, and that includes John Boylan, the manager of Linda Ronstadt, who was looking for backup musicians to play with Linda on her upcoming tour. Boylan approaches Henley to see if he'll play drums on the tour, and Henley in turn reaches out to Frey to bring him into the loop. The Eagles bass player, Randy Meisner, grew up in Nebraska. Like Henley and Frey, he was in a series of bands in his teens. The most successful of these bands was an outfit called the Soul Survivors, who had a little bit of limited success with singles. They moved to LA in 1966, renamed themselves The Poor. They had glimpses of stardom. They ended up opening for Hendrix in New York, but nothing really happened for that band. In 1968, Buffalo Springfield was broken up, and Jim Messina and Richie Furay are building a new band called Poco, and Meisner auditions and gets the gig. They go right to the studio and record their first album, picking up the pieces, but even as the album is being mixed, Meisner leaves the band because he's pissed off that he's being left out of production decisions, goes back to Nebraska, thinks about giving up music, and gets a job at the local John Deere dealership selling tractors. When he eventually does come back to LA, his luck changes because John Boylan reaches out to him as well to see if he'll be on the Ronstadt tour. For his part, Bernie Leadon grew up in Minnesota playing bluegrass and country. He ends up moving to San Diego in 1963 and joins a group called the Scottsville Squirrel Barkers. One of the future members of the Byrds, Chris Hillman, was one of the Barkers. Eventually, Hillman, at this point part of the Flying Burrito Brothers, reaches out to Leadon along with Graham Parsons and brings them into the group in the late 60s. He does 2 albums with them, Burrito Deluxe and the Flying Burrito Brothers, but he's getting frustrated with the lack of commercial success. And so he's ready for a new opportunity when Boylan reaches out to him too and says, would you join the Ronstadt tour? Frey and Henley had already decided between themselves that they were going to form a band. Meisner surfaces as a good candidate on bass, and Ronstadt also pitches a band on Bernie Leadon because of his multi-instrumental capacity. And they didn't have much difficulty in attracting the attention of labels, and David Geffen, whom Frey knew through Jackson Browne, signed them up later in the summer for his label Asylum. At one point, the band takes a trip out to Joshua Tree, where they drink a lot of tequila and consume a fair amount of peyote, and it's on this trip that they resolve to call themselves Eagles. Eventually, they've written some songs, they've got Asylum's backing, and they need to head into the studio, so they need a producer. Frey wanted Glyn Johns because Glyn Johns had worked with a lot of the bands that the Eagles really admired, like Zeppelin, like the Stones, and so on. He hears them the first time, is not impressed, and goes away. Johns is persuaded to return a second time. He's still not impressed until he hears them sing Take the Devil, and he hears the harmonies in that song. At that point, he realized exactly what the band had and what the sound of the band could be on record. The band flies to England to make the record at Olympic Studios in London. Johns had heard those great harmonies. He could hear how talented they were in terms of their country and western musicianship, and he wanted the album to have a real country flair. For their parts, Fry and Henley really wanted the album to have more of a rock and roll sound. So in kind of a foretaste of what was to come, there was lots of dissension during the making of what was otherwise an excellent record. Geffen heard the original tape of the album and thought it needed another vocal by Henley, and so the song Nightingale was added. More dissension over this because Johns didn't like that song at all. He tried to record it at Olympic and it hadn't worked and he tossed it aside. So Geffen took the band to another studio and recorded it, which pissed Johns off even more. Recognizing that the label head was basically behind the song, he knew he had to record it. He took the band to a third recording location, Wally's, and re-recorded it under his specifications. Already we can see a pattern forming here with this band. There's lots of brilliance, there's lots of different influences, and there are lots of leaders and not many followers when it comes to the way that the creative output was ultimately determined. The album starts with Take It Easy, that song which is so evocative of that early era of the Eagles. There's so many great things about this song, from those shimmering opening chords, the excellent, witty, engaging lyric and the story it tells. For me, my favorite part of the song these days is actually Bernie Leadon's banjo, which I don't even know if it registered with me the first few times I heard it. Now I just think it's integral to the song. It turned a good song into a great one. Henley likes to say that this song evokes a sense of motion. I think it absolutely does, both in the lyrics and in the music. A stellar tune, and one arguably that was as good as anything they ever did. That's followed by the Leadon and Henley composition Witchy Woman. This is incidentally Henley's only songwriting credit on this album. This is, of course, that 70s trope about evil magic ladies. The story of this song is very much the story of the riff. Leadon had previously written it while he was with the Burrito Brothers, and then he brings it into the recording sessions. The band likes it. For them, it seems to evoke the soundtrack to John Ford's Western movies with Native American warriors. There's a whole little stream of music in American popular culture, not all of which is entirely savory, which is based on what white film directors thought Native American powwow music sounded like. The consensus these days from people who've dug into this is that the first actual recorded instance of this or a similar sounding kind of a theme occurs in a 1950s cartoon called Powwow the Indian Boy, which is quite possible members of the Eagles would have seen.
Powwow the Indian boy loved all the animals and the woods. Powwow the Indian boy loved all the animals and the woods.
Anyway, through whatever obscure route of cultural appropriation, you end up with a version of this melody here in this song. Next we have Glenn Frey's Chug All Night, which I'm tempted to suggest is his worst ever composition. The only thing which prevents me from doing that is I also heard his 80s albums. That's back to back with another Frey composition, Most of Us Are Sad. I think this is okay. I think it's let down by Meisner's singing. It wasn't that he was a bad singer, but he was much better off doing backup vocalizing and harmonizing than he ever was actually taking the lead, to my ears anyway. Side 1 closes with Nightingale, which is a song that Glyn Johns didn't like, but I actually love it. And this is a Jackson Browne composition. The way it's produced sounds to my ears a lot like the way that Fleetwood Mac would sound a few years later, so it's a little bit ahead of its time. Side 2 starts with Train Leaves Here This Morning, and this is a song which Bernie Leadon had written with Gene Clark when they were still with the Burrito Brothers. I love the acoustic guitar solo, and then the song ends with a lovely harmony which caps off what I think is a little country rock masterpiece. That's followed by Take the Devil, which of course was a song which sold Johns on the band. Meisner wrote this song, he takes the lead vocal, he's no stronger than he was in the previous song. The rest of the playing I think is great, but for me, this is not one of the stronger pieces. Early Bird is a joint composition of Leadon and Meisner. For me, this song is all about the musicianship, the banjo playing from Leadon, and the slide guitar, I presume done by Frey. The second last song on side 2 is one of the great highlights not only of this album, but of their whole career, and that is, of course, Peaceful Easy Feeling, the song written by Jack Tempchin. Glenn Frey's laid-back delivery, I think, is excellent. I love the pedal steel playing, and it has, to me, one of the great pieces of writing, that wonderful couplet, which does a total hairpin turn in terms of its meaning. I found out a long time ago what a woman can do to your soul, but then, she can't take you anyway, you don't already know how to go. I've always loved that line, which turns the song from a very good song into a truly great one. The very last song on the album is another Meisner composition, and that's Tryin'. Along with Chug All Night, it's the only other real sort of straight-ahead rock song here. Meisner singing is okay, but he sounds kind of generic. To me, too often in the early Eagles songs, when it's Meisner or Levin singing, it just doesn't rise above the ordinary, and I'm afraid that's the case with this song as well. The Eagles' debut album is fascinating in a number of ways. It's fascinating because of the talent and the chemistry which lead to so many great moments here that just speak to the undeniable greatness of the band going forward. It's also fascinating because of the imperfections and experiments that don't really work. To me, when I listen to this, you can hear this band stretching in so many different directions. You can hear that this is a band with lots of ideas, lots of intelligence, lots of leadership, but it was never actually going to be that stable of an experiment, and that's how it would prove, although there would be moments of great brilliance all the way along that path. For me, this is a great album by a band which was still very much a work in progress, and it's a 4 out of 5.